most pastors I know would rather do a funeral than a wedding. But it does, I think, also surprise most of us how much deep joy we find walking with families through such challenging times.
Blessings to you in the name of Jesus Christ, and welcome back to Pastors for Pastors, the podcast that supports and celebrates pastors. I'm Ken Broman, folks, and it's good to have you join us as we continue the conversation we started last time with our 5 pastors who are in their first decade of ordained ministry. I truly admire the honesty and openness with which they share their joys and their sorrows in making that hard transition from regular person to the reverend, who gets treated differently by others. Just a brief introduction of our guests before we return to the conversation. Taylor Barner is Associate Minister for Youth and Young Adult Ministries at First Presbyterian Church in Burlington, North Carolina. Kate Morrison is Solo Pastor of John Calvin Presbyterian in Salisbury, North Carolina. Jeff Smith is pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Boone. Wes Pitts is the pastor of First Presbyterian in Reedsville, North Carolina. And Caroline Sell is Associate Minister at Westminster Presbyterian in Greensboro, North Carolina. Let's rejoin this honest and insightful conversation. So, what has been a joy that you have discovered as you have begun ordained ministry that you didn't expect?
That's a tough question for me, because there's been so many moments where I'm like, man, I love what I'm doing. I love being here with these people, with these kids. But like more often than not, I might be screaming my head off at them, but I am loving every minute of it. But I think what encompasses all of that, though, is the love and the hospitality. I think a lot of times we talked in seminary. I remember numerous conversations in seminary about setting boundaries and recognizing the need for like self-care and our own spaces and stuff like that. And yeah, certainly those are important things. And I don't know why this is such a surprise to me, because this is what I experienced growing up as a kid in youth group and going to church. Was this community of love. They are there for you. Those bonds and those friendships, those connections, those things, that I think that's been the most surprising thing to me. I started in February of 2017, and that year we were going, it had already been planned out that they were going on a mission trip to Belize. And so I got there in February. That trip was in June. I had 4 months to build relationships with 44 other people, adults and students, and they had to trust me to get them to and back from a foreign country.
Without losing anyone.
Yes, and it's funny that you say that, because on the way down, we did lose 4 people. They got put on another plane because of regulations and whatnot. We got there late, and it was, I remember getting on that plane and feeling like I had already just blown it. I'm going to get back. I'm going to get fired immediately on the spot. And we went and it was a wonderful week of just getting to know the people down there and working alongside them. And but the part about it that relates to this question, I think, is when we got back, about a week later, I get a text message from one of the kids who, like, they never texted me prior to this. And they're like, hey, do you want to go get Zaxby's? And I was like, yes, like, I would love that. And that is I think the joy that we don't expect that. We don't expect that to be the thing that just brightens up your day.
I think for me, it's very similar. It's the relationships. There was a story in particular that I thought of when you first asked this question. It was actually a little moment. I had been at John Calvin Presbyterian for less than a year. I think it was less than a year. And it was our summer worship series. It's just a more casual kind of down to earth. We very intentionally try to incorporate our children that we have in the church and have them some space. And so one of the children was off kind of working in her little section, and we had just gotten done with the final hymn, and I had gone up to give my charge and benediction for the day. And here this little girl comes running up to me with her hands wide open like this. And she says, "Do you want some goldfish? Do you want some of my goldfish? Like, you want to share?" And I was like, this is such like a great moment. And so like I just gave her a second, and I just put my hand on her head and I said, "Give me just 1 second to say this one thing, and then I promise that I will share goldfish with you." But it was just the most beautiful and humbling moment that this, I think I actually said it it ended up being my charge, where I was like, go out into the world and share your goldfish. But those relationships have been some of the most beautiful things that I have encountered.
I think one of the biggest joys that I've found are those moments where your sense of call uh, meets the needs that are around you in a really profound way. I find that that has been the truest in my two different places of service in funerals. Um, I've only had the opportunity to do a single wedding, so I don't know how much that would be the same, but a funeral is just one of those places where I feel like I'm needed. I have gifts to serve in that area, and it makes a difference. And it's a I feel like it's kind of a morbid thing to say that has been a joy in my life, but it's just a place where I see my gifts being used for good.
Yes, sure. Certainly not a joy that people are suffering and grieving, but a joy that you've got gifts that you can minister to them in that experience. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Jeff, how about you?
I would second what Wes just said. I often find myself, I'd rather do, it sounds weird, but I'd rather do a funeral than a wedding. I've done so many weddings where I'm just a means to an end. And I enjoy doing weddings of the people that I know well, that I've had relationships with, because that's very meaningful. But doing weddings where there's no relationship, or you just need to be a pastor present to make something happen, is not something that I find much joy in. It's draining. But funerals, yes, absolutely. Like there's a need there, and folks need someone to help provide that comfort and guide them in the midst of that. One of the things for me that has been, and I don't know that this is a surprising joy, but to some degree it is the church being the church, not just within the church, but even to the pastors. So often pastors are the ones who are providing care all the time for the congregation. And my son got sick a couple years ago, my oldest son. He came down with an E. coli virus and was very, very sick. And after he supposedly got over this virus, he developed a post-secondary infection called HUS, which is less than 10% of people get. And it put him in Baptist Children's Hospital for 12 days. And he had to go on dialysis, and it was a very scary time for us. And our congregation surrounded us in the midst of that. He was having his dialysis port installed, and there was a called prayer meeting of the congregation in our gathering space at the church, where people came and prayed for him during his surgery time. And the outpouring of love that came from our members, they pastored to me. And so I think that's the joy of, yes, I'm called to shepherd them and to pastor to them, but our faith is to be mutual, and our love for one another is to be mutual. And so when you experience that and you find that you're on the receiving side of that, what a joy it is to know that you have people who love you as much as you love them.
How about you, Caroline?
So I echo a lot of what Jeff and Wes said, and I feel like most pastors I know would rather do a funeral than a wedding, so I don't think that was weird to say. But it does, I think, also surprise most of us how much deep joy we find walking with families through such challenging times. I thought I was going to go into youth ministry. That's what I had been doing before seminary. That's why I went to Princeton, because they had a dual degree in youth ministry there, and Kenda Dean was there. And it was while I did CPE during seminary that I started to kind of experience this weird joy through pastoral care. And so, while I'm not sure it's surprised me, in the last 3 years, it certainly did during my training, how much meaning I found from walking with folks through kind of the lowest moments that life can bring. I've been surprised by how much I love leading worship. That's not something, especially during seminary, I had a whole lot of questions about Reformed worship and why we did things. And I thought I was going to do youth ministry in a big church, and that wouldn't be a big piece of my work, and have grown to love worship, and certainly miss leading worship and community over the last year. My joy has not come from leading virtual worship, and I'm still very eager for that feeling, to be in a room with us worshiping in person together.
I'm reminded of Frederick Buechner's definition of where you find your call at that intersection of your great joy and the world's great need. And what you're saying lends credence to that. How about on the other end of that scale? What have you learned or experienced that was the opposite of joy, either pain or frustration?
Well, I think for me, coming back to the South has been a challenge. I think the pandemic's going to expedite all of this, but I felt like I kind of went back 10 or 15 years in the arc of American Protestant Christendom, and serving in churches in New Jersey and to an extent Baltimore. They'd already kind of had their huge drops in membership. They'd kind of had their times of conflict and identity formation through that. And the people who were there were the ones, kind of the remnant in many ways, the ones who were not going kayaking on the weekends, even though all their friends they were committed to the church. And so it's been a challenge to come back and again feel like I see where the ship is headed, and feel like we could make some changes now in church life, to bring more people along, to make a bigger impact. But there's some real resistance to that change because it hasn't been lived into as much yet. That's definitely been a challenge for me over the last couple of years.
I would say for me, one of the challenging things is conflict resolution. That's probably the most frustrating thing that I deal with in church life. It's one of those things that we can read about Jesus and what he tells us to do in terms of going to one another if there's a problem and talking to that person about it. But for some reason, people refuse to do that. Instead, they come to the pastor and say, you need to go to them. I had a deacon who got upset with a member who came to me and said she was not going to be a deacon anymore because she was so upset about what had happened. And it was the perfect storm where two people who have the same personalities, that are very confrontational, butt up. And, and I said, well, I can't accept your resignation as a deacon. God called you to this order of ministry. Why is God calling you out of it? It's not easy just to, there are no greener pastures. You can go to another church, there'll be conflict there. How we deal with it here matters, and it shows our love for one another. So I think that's the most frustrating thing, is that this is what we preach, this is what we try to practice, and when folks refuse to do that, it's easier to kind of just ignore it or to walk away from it rather than actually embrace it.
I am 100% in agreement with Jeff. My time at my previous church was one where there was tremendous conflict, and I frequently was put in the middle of it. And that was the reason that I really began to question my call to continue in the church. Because, the church is one of those bodies where you don't get to choose who's there. And sometimes I really wish I could. It's just filled with broken people, and that's hard. And we do not deal with one another as lovingly as we are called to. and that creates all sorts of problems. But I also resonate with what Caroline said, because being in the South, I went to seminary in Chicago, which was a very different place to experience religious life. And I did my internship in a very non-traditional community. And so to come back to the South and have only lived in very conservative areas, where Presbyterians are seen as these anomalies, but it's this very strange thing where, uh, everyone has this idea of what the Bible Belt looks like, and people's commitment to faith. But in Rockingham County, where I live, only 30% of people go to church. So where are these other 70%? Uh, and especially in the deep red South, that's supposed to be the heartland for the church. And so it's not just the Presbyterians that have lost members. Our churches, well, they were over 500 20 years ago, and now we're 130. And so it's not just a phenomenon that we're experiencing, but reshaping what people think of as the church is a huge challenge. That happens to be something I'm really passionate about, and that's one reason I like serving in a rural area in a church. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but man, is it hard.
I am very much a person that likes to build bridges and try and build relationships. And so when someone kind of puts up that wall and says, I have no interest in that with you, no matter how hard you try, um, for me, that's difficult. But as I said earlier, it's kind of, I have to get to a place where I'm like, well, that's more about you. It's not going to stop me from loving you and trying to be a pastoral presence, but that's more about you. And I'll do what I can, as much as I can. I will say another thing for me has been uh, the comments that I so often get, that have nothing to do with my ministry. I get comments all the time about, oh, well, your hair looks great. Comments about my appearance, comments that, just I can think of a million off the top of my head right now of comments that I've gotten, and just how I'm like, okay, so you literally didn't hear the sermon at all. You just were raging over the blazer that I decided to wear today. I'm sorry that you feel that way, but that has nothing to do with ministry.
It's interesting that you have talked about the greatest joy as experiencing the grace that a congregation or a church family can offer you, and that the most difficult part are the times when grace is not offered at all, both in the same church families. Those both of those things can be experienced. I would hate to actually go back and examine myself for this, but my guess is I've probably been the vehicle of grace offered and grace refused. So what about that pandemic?
You want to talk about things they didn't prepare you for in seminary? There you go.
Yeah, that's tied to seminary. What about that pandemic? How has that impacted you in ministry? Or how has it not?
It definitely has. It's draining. It's draining on us. I know it's draining on my students. It's draining on our congregation. We've got people that are so scared about coming back, but they want to come back so bad. And there is something to it, though, that it gives us this chance to be creative. It gives us this chance to think creatively about the ways in which we do ministry, and maybe even to identify some of the spots that need strengthened. But man, it is draining. It has taught me a lot about myself. It's nothing that anybody could have prepared you for, though. So I don't mean to put the blame on seminary for that, but
yeah, you can't blame
I can't blame Presbytery. I can't blame seminary. I can't blame
Yeah.
anybody for it. It is unprecedented, for us at least. But in thinking about it too, it's the same thing as somebody who has gone through a deep tragedy, or a deep loss. This sense of grieving together in a sense, this idea of coming together and rallying together and not fighting against one another. That's, I think, the things that really drag communities down is this idea of, well, this is my church and this is the way that I want it. It's tough to thrive in the midst of a pandemic. I would wager that very few people are thriving right now. Maybe some people are enjoying going to church in their pajamas. I know I would love to do that, but there's something though for that in-person communal aspect that we've lost, and doing what we can in the midst of this to stay as one community, as one body of Christ.
We both talked about how important relationships are to us, Taylor, and that has been the hardest thing, is not being able to be in person. And I mean, it's one thing to be on Zoom, it's one thing to be over, and build community that way, but it's another thing to be like to sit and break bread together, and to sit and share the cup of coffee. A big one for me has been, being able to go into the communities where the retirement communities where my people live, and that's not allowed. And that has been so difficult because those are also many of the people that don't have the technologies to access worship how we're doing it right now. Trying to find those ways to do that pastoral care and continue those relationships. And Taylor hit the nail on the head. It is, it's exhausting. I haven't had one yet. I've had some COVID dreams, but I actually had a COVID dream last night that it wasn't even a member of my church. It was no person that I knew, but they were yelling at me to go back to worship, like in-person worship. And they were so angry that we were not going, and they kept saying, well, we're just one person away from everyone being vaccinated. And I was like, I'm not going to get my vaccine for at least another month. Obviously, COVID is on my brain. But yeah, so it's really, I know for me, it's been the stresses of wanting to make sure that my people are cared for, but then also balancing that I want people to be safe. I've just heard so many stories of, people going to church and that's where they get it. I think if it happened at our church and someone did get sick by us gathering, that our congregation would be devastated. Our community just loves and cares for each other so much that I think that would be really difficult.
Yeah, we early on in the pandemic read Susan Beaumont's book, something along the lines of leading when you don't know where you're going. And she wrote that before the pandemic, but it came out in 2019, I think. And so it was timely. And I still feel like we're leading when we don't know where we're going. And we're starting to get to the point where we're feeling pressure to have a sense of where we're going. As vaccines are becoming more available and the numbers thankfully are going down and warmer months are coming. But I still don't think we really know where we're going. And so we've just kind of been in this liminal space for so long that it's exhausting. I think we're all tired. I heard Bishop Michael Curry say in a podcast a few months ago, we're all on edge. And he's reminding his staff regularly, we're all on edge. And I'm sensing that. I preach about every 5 or 6 weeks, and preaching is getting harder and harder for me to just have an idea of like what the main idea should be, as I feel increasingly disconnected to people. It's definitely been a challenging season. I think the blessing that could come out of this, especially for, again, a large church like ours that's used to the church kind of mediating individuals' faith life, providing them the resources to turn to all the time, is they've been forced to develop spiritual practices at home that they never have. I know of one family that is no longer worshiping on Sunday mornings together, but they watch the worship service just before dinner on Sunday nights, and then they have a conversation about it. things like that I think have developed at home, and especially in the Christian formation world, is really exciting to me. And I think, that may not show in numbers or in tithes, but maybe in richness of faith, which matters more in the end.
I started in October of 2019, was ordained in January, and we had the last in-person thing I did was a funeral in the very beginning of March. And then we've been either outside or pre-recorded or live streaming ever since. Like I mentioned before, because the age of my congregation, I'm not having contact with them. I'm not the type of person. Some of my weaknesses are really being highlighted in this moment. I crave that personal touch. I don't do well over the phone. I don't do well even with Zoom. I just don't have that same connection where I can be present. It's just been so hard to maintain connection with the church. I think, for worship, we generally continue to be at or even a little bit above what we used to get in the sanctuary on Sundays. Whereas, we're 75 average on Sunday morning. We're getting anywhere from 60 to 90 views on a service. And so if you have multiple people watching each one, we're doing pretty well. But I have no idea who they are. I'm making no contact with them. I'm preaching to empty pews, and that is the worst experience as a pastor. And so I feel like after the pandemic, when we began to transition to a new normalcy, I'm going to have to re-engage and reintroduce myself and re-meet people. And we'll see how that goes. I know we've lost a couple of members who wanted to be in person and thought we were being stupid for not being in person. Whereas others, even if we have opportunities where we can be distanced or whatever, they still won't take the risk. And so just trying to find that balance is just so hard. Because there is no class in seminary to teach you how to do this. And everything you do, you feel like you have made the wrong decision. And someone will tell you why. Or in the case of being new there, they'll just say why to someone else, and then you'll hear third or fourth hand, maybe. God will see us through, but it certainly hasn't made life easy.
I am curious about what you have discovered that perhaps seminary did not prepare you for, and maybe couldn't. It's okay. We're not trying to blame seminaries here, but what is it that you found that that MDiv degree did not prepare you for?
Yeah, apparently, I missed the pandemic class.
Yeah.
I didn't take that as an elective. The pandemic has, I think, turned ministry completely upside down, and the thing that I've grieved the most is being able to have personal contact. We've taken that for granted as church, I think, for many years, that being together in community and fellowship. I mean, I think we all appreciate it, but I think we have a deeper appreciation for it now than we ever have. Being able to go to the hospital to pray with someone before surgery, doing funerals only at gravesides and not in our sanctuary, feels like you're robbing someone of, the grieving process. So there's a lot of bad things that have become part of the pandemic. There are also positives, though, and so I'd like to focus more on that. But it has forced our congregation to change the way we do worship. And so obviously, not having live streaming capabilities and stuff, we've had to go to pre-recorded worship services that have provided us more outreach. And one of the neat things that has happened in the midst of this is that we've had people joining us online and engaging in Sunday school or reaching out to the church that have never stepped a foot in our door and met us. And so we do a Moravian Love Feast every year. That's been a tradition of this congregation for over 40 years. And this was the first time we've never been able to do it in person. And generally our sanctuary is packed. So generally we'd have 400 people crammed into our congregation. And we did it online. And we had at least 450 views. And when you begin to think about the number of people watching that, it exceeded what we could put in our sanctuary. And same for Christmas Eve and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think that in the midst of all the difficult things, there's been positives that has forced us to look at our broader outreach differently, and that we can't turn back from this. That even when we get back into the sanctuary, like we're already talking about purchasing live streaming capabilities to provide that for an ongoing you move forward. And so I think that it's made us rethink church of how we do things and how do we sustain those things in the future.
So, there's just no way seminary could have prepared us for this. At my seminary, there was always students who wanted the seminary to offer more practical classes on budgeting, classes on leadership. I was never particularly on board with that. I think those are things you can learn on the fly, even if you're overwhelmed for a year or two or 10. But the theological foundations, I don't have time to read the texts I read in seminary or have the conversations at the level that I had in seminary now. And I think that's what seminaries are uniquely able to offer. So, and that's my opinion. We probably have a whole conversation about that. But yeah, there's so much that seminary did not teach me about leading during this time. But I think it's okay.
The one thing the seminary didn't prepare me for, and this is actually a comment that my father made, my father's in banking and trust advising. He said that, why don't y'all have any finance classes at seminary, like about how to read a budget sheet or prepare a budget sheet or anything like that? I remember going to my first session meeting here at First Pres. It was the first time I saw one, really, and I was like, oh dear Lord, like I'm so glad I'm the associate. The other thing that I think seminary didn't prepare me for, and it really can't unless you go through it for the first time, is that first experience of loss in a community, one that is tragic and sudden, and the grief that you feel. I remember in our pastoral care class at Pittsburgh Seminary, Dr. Leanna Fuller told us that you won't get it really until you get into that space, and you're a part of that community, and you're just gutted. Like it feels like the rug's been pulled out from under you, and we had that last year in our community with a younger family whose kids were in the youth group and had just recently joined the church. And the mourning that we do as well as pastors is, I just remember coming home from the hospital that night after having seen the family and seen the kids, and it's just like, there's no book I could read, there's no study I could do, there's nothing that would prepare me for that moment, and that's not on seminary to do. We had a wonderful internship program and a field experience program working with local congregations, but even in that, it's just, unless you go through it, you're not going to have that experience. You're not going to grow.
Yeah, you can do as much clinical pastoral education. You can be in those you can experience it in different ways, but until you really do experience it in that own community that you're invested in, it is, yeah, that's devastating. I echo both of the things that Taylor said. Grief in a community is hard. And I know certainly I've gotten a number of comments that people are like, I thought pastors were supposed to be able to distance themselves emotionally. Like they're supposed to be able to carry themselves through these emotions and through these situations. And I think that there's something about being able to show emotion as a pastor and say that we too are so deeply embedded in that grief. I adore my worship professor, Dr. Kim Long from Columbia, because one day she was presiding we had chapel every day, but on Fridays we had communion. And I had never seen a pastor cry, like in the middle of a service, never witnessed it. And as she was saying the words of institution and breaking the bread and pouring the cup, she just started sobbing, and just tears pouring down her eyes and down her face. And that was just one of the most touching things to me. And I have carried it throughout my life, throughout my ministry. I think being able as a pastor to show emotion helps us to build some of those relationships and say, hey, we're in this with you.
And I think that really offers the model. I've had folks who said, well, you're supposed to be the strong one. And my sense that I've kind of gained over the years is that those are the folks who are afraid of their emotions. And so they're looking to me to be the model to keep everything in and bottled so they can too. But I think being the model of being able to say it's okay to show those emotions, and that's the healthiest way to handle those emotions, is not to bottle them up, but to let them come out. Right. Even though they may not want you to do that, it's still modeling the best and healthiest way to deal with it.
The only other thing I'll say about seminary itself, I felt like Columbia did an excellent job of giving me and preparing me for the backgrounds and the basics. So theology, some of the pastoral care, the book stuff, stuff like that. And even though I have a degree in practical theology, I wish that I had more of that practical experience. And reading a budget, clergy taxes, leading session meetings, even at the presbytery level, I didn't realize that you had to address the moderator in a certain way.
Those practical aspects of ministry, you just, yeah. And I get it. You can't, there's no way in 3 years of seminary you can learn all those things in terms of your future, the gifts that you've discovered that you had or confirmed that you thought you had, and where you feel like God might be leading you in the future. And I'm not asking you to divulge anything that might be damaging to the current situation you're in.
What a way to break the news to my congregation. It's just, no, just kidding.
Yeah, that's right. Gosh, Kate, at the very beginning, it almost sounded like you said you weren't sure you were going to stay in ministry and some things like that. I'm just curious.
Right now I do. That's definitely where I feel called, is ministry. I think it's more been the experience of a number of my colleagues who have, who started out in ministry and they made it to year 3 or 4 and they're like, this is not for me. I've tried. I will have been ordained 5 years in July. This will be 9 years in ministry for me total. Having worked in other positions and in aspects of the church. So I still do very much feel like my call currently is to the church. When I went to seminary, I never saw myself as being a solo pastor or a head of staff. That was something that God had to work in me. I just think ministry is something that it's a special calling. And I think that there are also other things that I feel called to as well. I mean, not saying that I would ever forego those for ministry, but it's finding that balance, right? Of being able to do those things. I feel very called to social justice and very called to being able to be active in the community in those ways and working in those ways. So finding that balance between ministry life, social life, personal life.
Taylor, how about you? You expect to be a youth minister the rest of your life?
Well, so I took a couple of youth ministry courses. Actually, it was something we had 2 courses that were offered in youth ministry at PTS, taught by the same couple. And I remember them saying, like, at some point you feel this pull to pass the torch, so to speak, when it comes to youth ministry. Or this feeling that like somebody else is better equipped for the current generation or the coming generations. I love what I do. I want to do this for the rest of my life. I would love to do that. But I also do recognize that there are other things that God may or may not call me to do. And I have felt a particular calling to someday go and get my doctorate. And I would love to, at the church that I find myself at later in life, also maybe teach a little bit. Part-time at a local college or something like that. We had a professor in college where I went who was local pastor and taught one class a semester. And I think that there is nothing greater than giving back a little bit of the knowledge that I've gleaned from so many others throughout my life. For the foreseeable future, I'm here in Burlington, North Carolina, and who knows where that takes me, but I hope that I have the joy of working with kids and college students for the rest of my life.
I just think it's all about, specifically regarding this last question, I think it's all about following the call, just being faithful to that call that God has put on our lives, and how that shifts. Because as I said, I never in a million years thought that I'd be a solo pastor. I thought that I was going to be an associate for quite some time, and I was for 2.5 years. But God ultimately called me to serve in another way, which I'm very grateful for, because it has opened my world in a lot of ways, and has also brought me back closer to my personal community, with my family. And
I really don't know. So as I mentioned, we're a clergy couple, which makes things challenging. My husband wrapped up a 2-year pastoral residency last summer and hasn't received a call yet. So we're just kind of open right now to where the Spirit may lead us 5-10 years down the road. And we kind of have to stay flexible with negotiating each other's sense of call. Right now I'm kind of been the leader of the two of us to bring us here and kind of have the call, but I'm flexible down the line as to if I'm more of the secondary person doing interim ministry, or I've always, ever since CPE, wondered about a residency in a hospital. Right now I feel called here, and we'll see where the Spirit leads. Coming into
When I accepted this call in Reedsville, I told them that, my goal is to be here for 10 years. I'm committing myself to a long-term experience. My son was 3 months old when I accepted the call. And so, I don't want to have him move around a whole lot as he grows up. I moved 11 times before I went to college. So, and not having clergy parents, that's not what I want for him. And so between what I expect from my own family and what my family wants, and really I want to create a long-term thing here in one place. I accepted the call thinking that was possible. So 5 to 10 years, 10 years, I would expect to possibly be starting something new.
I have 2 boys, and my oldest will be a 9th grader this coming year, and my other will be a 6th grader. And I want them, they need home. And this has been home for them for the most part, their longest stint. And I want them to be able to graduate from high school and, before they go off to college, and to have a place of home. So my plan, whether it's God's plan or not, is to be here longer. I'm in the middle of my D-Min program, and I know that God's called me to do that. I don't yet know what God's going to do with that, but I know that I'm doing it because I've been called to it. So I don't know. I've learned that I'll never say that I won't do something, because God will make me eat those words, and I've eaten them before. And so I'm open, but I'm very prayerful that God will allow us the opportunity to stay here, at least so that my kids can finish up school.
Well, listen, this has been a delight. I thank you for spending this time with me and with all of us. I want to thank Taylor, Kate, Jeff, Caroline, and Wes for taking the time and having the courage to let us into their lives for a glimpse at what it's like to be in the first decade of ministry. For some of us, it's a reminder of past experiences. For others, an insight into what they have never experienced. Next week, we'll continue our conversation as we talk to pastors in their second decade of ministry, when most things are not new, but setting new goals for growth and service is often the primary focus. Thanks for joining us, and thank you again for your leadership of Christ's body, wherever you may be. Until next time, I'm Ken Broman Folks, and this is Pastors for Pastors.